The scientific field memory model of human experience. A systems framework integrating trauma, attention, embodied regulation, and collective dynamics. Abstract. This paper proposes a systems-based framework for understanding individual and collective human experience as an emergent property of memory, attention, embodied regulation, and social field coupling. Rather than treating trauma, identity, and meaning-making as purely intrapsychic phenomena, the model conceptualizes them as dynamic attractor states within a distributed self-system that is continuously shaped by biological inheritance, developmental conditioning, and interpersonal synchronization. Central to the model is the idea that emotionally charged memory networks bias attentional selection and prediction, which in turn shape autonomic regulation, behavior, and social interaction. These processes form self-reinforcing loops at both individual and collective levels. Epigenetic inheritance and attachment dynamics are understood as initial conditions that increase the probability of certain attractor states being activated. The model offers a non-metaphysical reinterpretation of concepts often described as soul, karma, or collective consciousness, reframing them as emergent informational patterns within human regulatory systems. Clinical and societal implications are discussed, with emphasis on safety-based regulation as a prerequisite for durable change. 1. Introduction. Modern psychology has made significant advances in understanding trauma, attachment, affect regulation, and memory reconsolidation. However, these domains are often treated as separate explanatory layers: cognitive, emotional, somatic, interpersonal, or cultural. This fragmentation obscures the fact that human experience operates as a single integrated system. This paper introduces the scientific field memory model of human experience, a unifying framework that integrates trauma theory, predictive processing, autonomic nervous system regulation, epigenetic inheritance, attachment and relational dynamics, social and cultural entrainment. The model aims to explain why trauma repeats across individuals, families, and societies, and why insight alone often fails to produce lasting change. 2. Conceptual foundations. 2.1. The distributed self model. Rather than viewing the self as a fixed entity, this model conceptualizes identity as a distributed self model, a dynamically maintained pattern spanning neural networks, bodily states, memory systems, and relational expectations. This self-model is not localized but emerges from coordinated activity across implicit and explicit memory. Affective valuation systems. Interoceptive and autonomic signals. Social feedback loops. What is often referred to as the soul in spiritual discourse is here understood as the total organized informational pattern of the individual embedded within a relational and cultural field. 2.2. State space and attractor networks. Human experience can be modeled as movement through a state space composed of multiple possible self-states, for example, safe, threatened, connected, ashamed, agentic. Trauma forms high-gain attractor networks, states that are entered easily and exited with difficulty. These attractors bias perception, interpretation, emotion, and behavior. The model uses the metaphor of a barcode to describe these parallel latent states. Different experiential configurations exist simultaneously, but only one is dominant at any given moment. 3. Core mechanism, the field memory loop. 3.1. The loop structure. The central loop of the model unfolds as follows. 1. Observation or cue, an external event, relational signal, internal image, memory, or media input. 2. Appraisal and prediction, based on prior learning, attachment history, and inherited sensitivity. 3. Affective activation, emotion arises as an action-oriented prediction. 4. Autonomic regulation shift, safety leads to ventral vagal regulation. Threat leads to sympathetic or dorsal dominance. 5. Behavior and communication, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or pro-social engagement. 6. Social feedback and entrainment, others respond and synchronize emotionally. 7. Memory reconsolidation, activated networks are strengthened or weakened depending on safety. 8. Updated predictive priors shaping future perception. This loop operates continuously and automatically. 3.2. Memory load and regulatory capacity. The model employs a symbolic formulation: experienced intensity equals memory load times regulatory capacity squared, where memory load refers to the cumulative effective charge recruited from prior experiences. Regulatory capacity refers to metacognitive awareness, autonomic flexibility, and relational safety. High memory load combined with low regulatory capacity produces overwhelming experience and defensive behavior. 4. Trauma as present state activation. In this framework, trauma is not primarily a past event but a present-day activation of a memory effect network. When safety is insufficient, memory reconsolidation does not occur. Instead, the network is reactivated and reinforced. This explains why repeated exposure without safety can worsen symptoms. Effective therapy therefore requires altering the regulatory context, not merely revisiting content. 5. Epigenetics and transgenerational transmission. 5.1. Biological initial conditions. Epigenetic mechanisms, for example, methylation patterns, influence stress responsivity, emotional sensitivity, and autonomic thresholds. These biological parameters function as initial conditions in the self system. Children do not inherit trauma memories per se, but they inherit biases in threat detection and regulation, which shape how experience is processed. 5.2. Family and cultural transmission. Attachment patterns, emotional modeling, and sociocultural narratives further reinforce these biases. Together, biological and relational inheritance create continuity across generations. This process has historically been described as karma or soul contracts. Here it is understood as systemic transmission of regulatory parameters. 6. Collective dynamics and cultural trauma. At the societal level, the same loop operates. Repeated historical failures to ensure safety, for example, war, oppression, systemic violence, produce institutionalized threat governance, where control replaces protection. Protective systems degrade into dominance-based systems when chronic threat overwhelms regulatory capacity. This dynamic explains cycles of polarization, authoritarianism, and collective fear. The model frames this as a collective attractor state, not as moral failure. 7. Integrity, protection, and cultural transition. Religious and mythological archetypes often encode these dynamics symbolically. The figure of Christ, for example, can be interpreted as an archetype of non-collapsing integrity under threat, a stable regulatory state that maintains protection of vulnerability without resorting to aggression. In scientific terms, the so-called return of Christ consciousness corresponds to a cultural phase shift, from threat-governed control to safety-governed protection. From reactive dominance to stable, ethical agency. This transition requires restoration of emotional safety at both individual and systemic levels. 8. Clinical implications. 8.1. Safety as primary intervention. Cognitive insight is insufficient when autonomic threat dominates. Interventions must prioritize co-regulation, somatic safety, relational attunement, titrated exposure. 8.2. Reframing regression. Therapeutic regression is better understood as reactivation of an attractor network, not literal return to the past. 8.3. Social field awareness. Highly sensitive individuals may require interventions addressing environmental and relational load, including boundaries and media exposure. 9. Testable predictions. The model predicts that increased perceived safety will reduce trauma reactivation even without narrative change. Threat-saturated environments will amplify defensive behavior via social entrainment. Group regulation practices will increase coherence and reduce conflict. Epigenetically sensitized individuals will show lower threat thresholds. Durable change will correlate more strongly with relational safety than insight. 10. Limitations and future research. Further empirical work is needed to quantify social field coupling mechanisms, examine bioelectromagnetic contributions, integrate large-scale cultural trauma metrics, and model attractor dynamics computationally. 11. Conclusion. Human suffering, repetition, and conflict are best understood not as moral failure or individual pathology, but as predictable outcomes of complex adaptive systems operating under chronic threat. Healing, individually and collectively, emerges when safety enables regulatory capacity, allowing memory networks to reconsolidate and new self-states to become accessible. What has historically been called soul is thus redefined as the coherent informational pattern of human experience, held, expressed, and transformed within relational and collective fields.